Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we'll spend some quiet time with Rome and with the long, layered life of a city that began as a small settlement beside a river and slowly became something far larger than anyone living there could have imagined. We'll move gently through its early hills, its forums, its republic, its emperors, and the ordinary streets where most people lived their days in ways that history often remembers only softly. If you'd like, you can leave a like, subscribe, or even share a comment about where you're listening from tonight, or what calm subject you might enjoy next. But only if it feels right, of course. For now, let the room grow quieter. Let your shoulders rest. There is no rush here. Rome does not need to be crossed quickly. We can wander through it slowly, one street at a time, and notice the small details that made the city endure, change, and endure again. So in the gentle dark of this evening, we begin with the simple question of how a city on the banks of the Tiber came to shape so much of the world around it, and what it might feel like to walk there in another age. Before Rome became a symbol, before it became an empire, before its name was spoken with awe by distant people who had never seen it, it was a place. A place with hills, with mud, with water, with animals, with roads that were not yet roads, and with homes that were simple enough to be missed by history if no one had bothered to look closely. The Tiber River mattered from the beginning. Rivers often do. They offer water, of course, but also movement, trade, and a sense that the land is not still, but open to the wider world. A city beside a river can listen to other places more easily. It can send and receive. It can grow in all the directions that matter. Rome's early landscape was not a grand marble stage. It was uneven, practical, and a little harsh. The hills around the site gave shelter and height. The river gave access and risk. There were marshy areas in the low ground, and these would later need to be managed, drained, paved, and folded into the life of the city. Even in this early form, there is something quietly Roman about the scene. Not perfect nature, not untouched wilderness, but a place gradually made usable by persistence. The old stories of Rome begin with names that feel larger than the evidence sometimes supports. Romulus, Remus, a she-wolf, a founding moment placed into legend so firmly that it became part of the city's own identity. The tale is familiar enough that it almost feels like a memory. Two brothers, a conflict, an origin, a city born through struggle. Whether one takes the story literally or not, it tells us something important about how Romans understood themselves. They liked beginnings that were sharp, decisive, and carried a sense of destiny. But behind the legend there was likely a slower truth. Settlements merging, families clustering on defensible ground, livestock, fields, and seasonal movement, a community becoming more organized because survival often rewards cooperation. Rome may have begun as several small communities growing close together, then slowly sharing walls, rituals, and interests. This is how many cities are made, not all at once but by the patient accumulation of need. There is a certain calmness in imagining the earliest Romans before the city was famous. They would not have known what Rome would become. No one can, while standing in the middle of a beginning. They would have known only the practical things: where to draw water, which path avoided the wet ground, which hill caught the breeze, which families could be trusted, which neighbor offered help when a roof needed repair. And perhaps this is the first quiet lesson of Rome. Greatness often begins as ordinary adaptation. A city is not always born grand. Sometimes it is simply a place where people keep showing up. Over time, the settlement grew more complex. Contact with neighboring peoples shaped language, dress, ritual, and ambition. The Etruscans, among others, influenced early Roman life in ways that are still visible in the traces of kingship, engineering, and ceremony. Rome was not isolated. It learned, it borrowed, it absorbed. This too would become one of its defining habits. It is easy from a distance to think of Rome as fixed, but early Rome was still forming itself, still choosing what kind of city it would be. Would it remain one more local power among many in central Italy, or would it become something more demanding, more organized, more enduring? For a while it still looked small, houses of wood and mud brick, narrow lanes, religious spaces that were important not because they were ornate, but because they made the world feel ordered. The sacred and the practical were not separate things. A blessing over a threshold, a festival day, a family altar, a public vow, all of these could belong to the same living pattern. And this is part of what makes Rome so interesting to return to slowly. It was never only one thing. It was at once a village, a city, a state, a power, a myth, and a memory. Even early on, those layers were beginning to gather. If one were walking there then, perhaps the most striking thing would not be any monument but the sense of change, the feeling that a place is becoming itself in real time. That kind of transformation has no marble plaque. It is noticed in the widening of a street, the building of a wall, the arrival of more people, the growing confidence in shared rules. Rules matter in cities. They shape who may speak, who may decide, who may own, who must wait. Rome's later history would be full of arguments about authority, dignity, duty, and law, but the roots of all that were there from the beginning, in the simple question of how many people can live together without everything falling apart. A city beside a river on uneven hills in a region of small powers grows by learning how to balance independence with cooperation. That balance would define Rome again and again. It would argue, it would adapt, it would harden, it would soften. It would remember old customs and invent new ones. And as the early settlement widened into a real city, it began to attract the habits that make cities feel permanent. Markets, rituals, defensive walls, shared celebrations, shared anxieties. A place becomes real in the minds of its people when they begin to depend on it for more than shelter, when they depend on it for identity. Rome would eventually give the world roads, laws, armies, architecture, language, and imperial imagination. But before all of that, it offered something simpler and perhaps more intimate. It offered a center, a place where the scattered efforts of families and clans could gather into a common story. That story would not stay gentle for long, but for now, in these earliest days, it is enough to imagine the river moving quietly past the banks, the hills standing dark in the evening light, and a small community learning, step by step, how to become a city. Rome's earliest traditional history passes through a period of kings, and though the details of those kings are partly shaped by legend, the idea itself is revealing. Early cities often imagine their beginnings through rulers because rule gives shape to memory. A king can stand in for an era. He gives a face to a process that was likely much broader and slower than the stories suggest. The Roman kings are remembered in fragments. Some are tied to institutions, some to war, some to religion, some to engineering. This mixture tells us that even in the oldest narratives, Romans connected power with order. To rule was not only to command, it was to organize. It was to perform duties that linked the human city to the divine world and to the practical necessities of everyday life. Religion in early Rome was not separate from civic life, it was woven into it. The gods were not abstract ideas kept in private corners of the mind. They were part of the city's calendar, its announcements, its victories, its openings and closures. A successful harvest, a safe crossing, a military campaign, a marriage, a foundation, all could belong to the same sacred field of attention. This can feel distant to modern minds, but it is also quietly familiar. People still make rituals around uncertainty. They still seek patterns, signs, and moments of assurance. Rome simply made those habits visible in public life and gave them administrative weight. The early kings, according to tradition, helped build temples, organize institutions, and define the city's identity. Whether each specific act belongs to one ruler or many is less important than the larger shape of the tradition. Rome liked to think of itself as a city that was carefully arranged, not casually thrown together. Even its myths point toward structure. One of the great early themes is the relationship between the city and its neighbors. Rome did not grow in emptiness. Around it were Latin communities, Sabines, Etruscans, and others, each with their own customs and strengths. The early history of Rome is, in part, the story of negotiation with this surrounding world. Marriage alliances, conflict, absorption, rivalry. Cities are shaped not only by what they build, but by what they must answer to. There is also in these early stories a sense of practical openness. Rome seems willing over time to incorporate people from outside itself. This habit would become one of its strengths. A city that can make room for others can often grow beyond what a closed identity allows. Rome would later do this on a huge scale, but the pattern begins early. It learns that belonging can be widened. The Forum, that famous center of Roman public life, would not always have looked like the place one imagines from later ruins and reconstructions. At first it was a working space shaped by need. Markets, assemblies, official gatherings, processions, business, gossip, announcements. It was the heart of a city learning to speak with itself, and that speaking mattered. To build a public life, people need not only walls and roads, but shared habits of speech. Who may speak in assembly, who may listen, who may decide, who may object. These are not small questions, they are the slow machinery of political life. Even in the earliest Roman setting, one can see the beginnings of a serious relationship with law and duty. Romans would become famous for both. They would construct systems and codify roles. They would remember offices, procedures, and obligations with unusual persistence. This did not make them calm in every moment. Rome was often turbulent, but it did mean that even turbulence could be recorded, argued over, and turned into precedent. The kingship period also reminds us that institutions often survive beyond the stories that created them. A city may move away from monarchy, but still preserve religious offices, ceremonial forms, and inherited customs. Rome would later reject kings in politics while keeping many traces of old royal time in its rituals. Memory is stubborn. It lingers in festivals, in titles, in habits of ceremony. And perhaps this is one of the reasons Rome feels so layered to us. It never completely shed its own past. It added to itself instead. Later generations built upon earlier ones while still walking on older ground. There is a quiet beauty in imagining early Rome as a place where public life was becoming more formal every year. The city must have felt increasingly crowded with expectations. Citizens had roles. Families had names, priests had functions, leaders had responsibilities. Even the gods had calendars. A growing city tends to become more specific. The larger it gets, the more it relies on distinctions. This office, not that one. This ritual, not another. This day is favorable. That day is not. Such distinctions may seem small, but they create the texture of civilization. And under all of it, the old geography still remained. The river, the hills, the ground underfoot, the weather. A city can only make so much of itself. It must still work with the shape of the place in which it stands. Rome's early kingship is therefore not just a list of names, even if one could remember them all. It is a way of seeing the city as an ordered community emerging from older patterns, learning to govern itself by combining ritual, law, memory, and a steadily growing sense of purpose. The transition from myth to republic would come later, and with it a very Roman habit of telling political change as a moral story. But before that turning point, there was this quieter, older Rome, a city practicing how to be itself. And as night falls in imagination over those early hills, one can almost hear the sounds that would have mattered most. Footsteps on packed earth, voices at a market stall, a call from one house to another, the murmur of prayer, the low, continuous work of a community becoming durable. Rome's move from kings to republic is one of the most famous shifts in its early history, and it is remembered as a rejection of monarchy in favor of shared civic power. The story is dramatic in outline, but what matters most for our purposes is the shape it gave to Roman political imagination. Romans came to believe very deeply that public authority should be limited, divided, and watched. The Republic was not democratic in the modern sense, and it certainly was not equal in the way many people today might hope. But it did create a complex system in which different offices, assemblies, and social groups each had their place. Roman politics became a field of negotiation, status, inheritance, and ambition. It was orderly on the surface and often tense underneath. The early republic is often remembered through the struggle between patricians and plebeians, two broad social groupings whose conflict shaped the development of Roman law and civic rights. This struggle did not resolve quickly. It unfolded over generations, and that too is important. Rome was not built by one clean decision. It was formed by repeated argument. There is something almost soothing in a strange way about how persistent Roman politics was. Not soothing because it was peaceful, but because it was structured. People knew there were offices to hold, assemblies to address, laws to debate, honors to pursue, and public standing to defend. Even conflict had channels. The Republic's strength lay partly in its adaptability. When pressure came from within, Rome could adjust certain rules. When pressure came from outside, it could reorganize armies and alliances. When one form of leadership became too concentrated, the city could split authority into multiple offices. This was not always graceful, but it was often effective. The consulship became one of the central offices of republican life. Two consuls, sharing the highest annual civil and military power, was a design that embodied Roman suspicion of permanent kingship. Even at the top, power was meant to be temporary and paired. This arrangement reflected a deep cultural preference for balance through rivalry. The Senate, too, grew in importance. It was not a modern elected legislature, but rather an enduring advisory body with enormous influence, especially through the prestige of its members and the continuity of its memory. If the consuls represented motion, the Senate represented continuity. Rome liked both. It liked to move and to remember at the same time. The Republic also produced a language of civic virtue. Romans praised discipline, courage, restraint, duty, and devotion to the common good, even if individuals often fell short of those ideals. Such values were not merely decorative. They became a way of judging men in public life. To be Roman was not just to belong to the city. It was to embody a certain style of seriousness. This moral dimension is one of the most fascinating things about Rome. The city never entirely separated politics from character. A leader was not only effective or ineffective. He was ambitious, restrained, dignified, reckless, dutiful, greedy, honorable, or corrupt. History itself was often told in such terms. As Rome expanded through Italy, it also learned the long, difficult business of alliance and incorporation. Some communities were defeated, others allied, others partially absorbed. Rome did not always erase local identities at once. Instead, it often created layers of obligation and privilege. This meant that power could spread while still keeping the appearance of order. This pattern would become one of Rome's great talents. It could conquer and then organize. It could impose and then regularize. It could bring difference under a legal framework without always making that difference disappear. The result was not simple unity, but managed variety. Roads began to matter more and more, not only as practical routes, but as symbols of Roman reach. To connect places with roads is to announce that distance has been domesticated. The Appian Way and other great routes would come later in full fame, yet the Roman habit of making the landscape carry movement was already taking shape. The countryside around Rome was never just scenery. It was an active field of farms, villages, shrines, military movement, and political identity. City and countryside interacted constantly. Grain had to be grown, men had to serve, land had to be defended. A republic depends on the people and the land at once. This is why Roman history can feel so grounded. There are grand speeches and ambitious laws, but also the plain fact of fields, roads, and supply. Empires are often discussed as abstractions, yet they are sustained by careful, repetitive labor. Someone must farm, someone must haul, someone must count, someone must repair. In the Republic, old customs continued to matter, even as new forms emerged. Public religion, domestic ritual, legal procedure, military obligation, and family authority all remained important. Rome did not abandon its roots in becoming a republic. It wrapped those roots in more elaborate institutions. One might imagine the city in these centuries as full of motion but not yet dazzling. Brick, stone, wood, smoke, dust, banners, sandals and voices, men in the forum, children in side streets, women managing households, markets and family affairs. Slaves moving between tasks, farmers arriving from outside the city, officials in ceremonial clothing. It was a busy place, but one whose importance lay not in spectacle alone, but in the steady creation of civic life. The Republic also developed a capacity for memory that would become central to Roman identity. Ancestors mattered, family lines mattered, public achievement mattered because it could be remembered. Masks, funerals, inscriptions, stories, and office lists all help turn the past into a living resource. And perhaps that is why Rome endures so powerfully in imagination. It remembered itself carefully. It turned civic success into lineage, and lineage into duty, and duty into story. The city did not merely happen, it was narrated into being. As this republic matured, its confidence grew, so did its appetite for competition. Within Rome, citizens competed for office and honor. Outside Rome, armies and alliances expanded the city's reach. A republic built on checking power could still become remarkably ambitious. That tension would define much of what came next. For now, though, it is enough to notice the shape of the republic itself, a city determined not to be ruled by kings but by offices and law, a city that believed public greatness should be earned, contested, and displayed, a city learning how to become a machine for collective ambition. And all the while the streets kept their ordinary rhythm, markets opening, doors unlatched, water carried, meals prepared. Paperwork, as we might call it now, though it would have been wax tablets, records, messages, and formal requests. The Republic, for all its ideals, was lived in these small repetitive acts. This is the pleasant paradox of Rome. The most powerful civilization of its world was also, in countless moments, simply a place where people went about their day. As Rome expanded beyond its first circle of influence, it became increasingly clear that the city's future would be built with roads, alliances, and armies. It is difficult to separate these things because in Rome they were deeply connected. A road could carry trade, but also soldiers. An alliance could stabilize a frontier, but also prepare the way for future domination. An army could defend the city, but also transform the city's politics once it returned home. The Roman legion became one of the most effective military institutions in the ancient world, though its form changed over time. At its core, it depended on discipline, organization, and the ability to coordinate large numbers of men with a sense of shared purpose. Roman soldiers were not only fighters, they were laborers too, building camps, roads, walls, and siege works as part of their campaigns. This practical quality is one of Rome's most notable features. Its power was never purely ornamental. Even conquest had infrastructure. A Roman army did not just arrive, it arranged itself, fortified itself, measured, built, and stayed long enough to change the landscape. Expansion across Italy brought Rome into contact and eventually conflict with various peoples and cities. Some were absorbed gradually, others resisted fiercely. The wars of this period are not memorable only for battles, but for the political map they reshaped. Rome's relationships became broader, more complex, and more unequal. By the end, the city stood at the center of a network rather than at the edge of a small region. The Punic Wars, especially the long struggle with Carthage, marked a decisive stage in Rome's rise. Carthage was a formidable maritime and commercial power, and the rivalry between the two states pushed Rome beyond its earlier comfort zone. It had to learn naval warfare, manage distant theaters of conflict, and sustain immense pressure over long periods of time. There is something almost meditative, if one can say that, about warfare without meaning approval, in the scale of Roman endurance. The Republic could absorb losses and continue. It could lose fleets, suffer invasions, endure setbacks, and still rebuild. This persistence became a kind of national habit. The image of Hannibal crossing the Alps has survived into popular memory with unusual force. It suggests not only military daring, but the harsh geography that ancient power had to confront. Mountains, weather, supply lines, terrain. Rome was not simply a city of generals. It was a city that learned, often the hard way, that the world itself had to be negotiated. In these centuries of expansion, Rome also began to accumulate wealth on a new scale. Spoils of war, tribute, land, captives, and commercial growth all changed the city's social structure. Some families became enormously influential. Public buildings became more ambitious. Patronage widened. Inequality deepened in visible ways. And so the Republic's success created new strains. A city that wins too much may begin to outgrow the habits that made it stable. Armies become more tied to commanders. Commanders become more personally powerful. Wealth becomes concentrated. Old civic ideals are praised even as they are challenged by reality. This is one of the recurring Roman patterns. Growth produces friction. Friction produces reform attempts. Reform attempts create resistance. And the cycle continues. The expansion of Rome also brought contact with Greek culture in ever greater measure. Greek art, philosophy, literature, and education became increasingly important to Roman elites. Some Romans welcomed this influence, others feared it would soften Roman character. That debate itself is revealing. Rome was never shy about borrowing from those it admired, conquered, or encountered, but it also wanted to remain recognizably itself. This tension between adoption and self-definition is everywhere in Roman life. It is visible in religion, where foreign cults could be received and adapted. It is visible in art and architecture, where Greek forms influenced Roman aesthetics while Roman materials and purposes reshaped them. It is visible in language, law, and elite education. The Roman road network, famous in later centuries, symbolizes all of this. Roads are connections, but they are also statements. They say that the center matters enough to be joined to distant places. They say movement should be reliable. They say the state intends to endure. If one were to travel the Roman world slowly, one would notice the changing textures of power. In one place, a colony. In another, a local town allied to Rome. Elsewhere, a provincial capital, military camps, temples, granaries, baths. Forums, markets. A Roman presence did not always look the same, but it often carried the same underlying logic: order, access, and hierarchy. Back in the city, the increasing importance of public performance made politics feel almost theatrical at times. Elections, speeches, processions, triumphs, and funerals all became occasions on which Roman identity could be displayed and reinforced. Public life was not hidden, it was enacted. That does not mean Romans were insincere. It means they understood that power lives partly in visible forms. A city, like a person, is often known by how it presents itself in moments of significance. Military success also shaped the city's calendar of remembrance. Triumphs celebrated generals, monuments commemorated victories, spoils were displayed, captured peoples entered the Roman imagination. History became a sequence of conquests and crises, each one folded into the growing story of the Republic. And yet beneath these public stories, ordinary life continued. Families still depended on harvests and weather. Household gods still received attention. Children still grew. The poor still searched for work and patronage. Soldiers returned to homes that might have changed while they were away. It is worth pausing on that continuity, because the greatest transitions in history are always lived among common routines. Rome's greatness came from a combination of organization and appetite. It knew how to use structure, it also knew how to want more. That combination proved powerful, but it was not peaceful. As the Republic expanded, it was carrying more than territory. It was carrying contradiction, a citizen body that valued restraint but rewarded ambition, a political system designed to limit kingship yet capable of producing near-monarchical figures, a city that admired its own old virtues while becoming richer, larger, and more unequal. All of that is already present in the expansion years, even before the final crises of the Republic arrive. One can almost sense the pressure building. The city is no longer small enough to be governed by the habits that once sustained it. Something larger, more difficult, more unstable is coming into view. But for a while longer, the roads remain open, the camps remain organized, the Senate continues to deliberate, and the Republic still believes, at least publicly, that it can hold itself together by means of law, custom, and disciplined repetition. Rome's Republic, after its long rise, entered a period of strain that became impossible to ignore. The growth that had once made the city strong now made it harder to manage. Armies were larger, commanders more powerful, wealth more concentrated, and political competition more intense. The city's institutions had been built for a smaller republic, and they now had to bear the weight of an enormous Mediterranean power. This is the moment when Roman history often feels especially human. Not because the figures are ordinary, but because the tensions are familiar. Public ideals collide with private ambition. Long traditions meet new realities. Systems designed for balance begin to bend under pressure. The conflict between the Gracchi and the Senate is one of the early signs of this deeper strain. Reform in Rome was rarely simple. Efforts to address land distribution, inequality, and political exclusion often met fierce resistance. The city was not short of arguments about justice, but it was often slow to change the structures that produced the arguments in the first place. There is something quietly tragic about this. Rome was capable of immense organization, yet struggled to resolve the social consequences of its own success. Conquest had brought wealth, but not equally. Military service had created veterans, but not always adequate security. Urban growth had created crowds, but not harmony. The Republic had become a machine for expansion before it became a machine for social balance. The late Republic produced some of the most famous Roman names in history: Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, Cicero. Their lives overlap in a landscape of rivalry, constitutional crisis, civil war, and rhetorical brilliance. It is tempting to treat them as larger than life, but they were also products of the institutions around them. Rome made such men possible, and then found itself endangered by what they could do. Marius and Sulla represented different paths through the changing military and political world. The army's loyalties increasingly mattered. Commanders could build personal followings. Marching on Rome, once unthinkable, became a political act. When a republic reaches the point where armed force can be used inside the city's own politics, something essential has already shifted. Sulla's dictatorship was a stark reminder that emergency powers can leave lasting marks. Even after he stepped away from power, the precedent remained. Rome had learned that constitutional norms could be broken, and once such a lesson is learned, it is hard to forget. The city would continue to argue about legality, but now under the shadow of what had already been done. Cicero, the great orator, gives us a different angle on the crisis. Through his speeches and writings, we can hear a Roman elite struggling to defend the Republic's values with words, while the underlying political world became more dangerous. Cicero believed deeply in the importance of law, civic duty, and the Senate's authority. He is often remembered for his eloquence, but also for the fragility of the order he hoped to preserve. Pompey and Caesar, meanwhile, show how military success and political power could become almost impossible to separate. Pompey accumulated prestige through victories abroad. Caesar rose through ambition, talent, and extraordinary command. The rivalry between them became one of the decisive episodes in Roman history. What had once been competition among magistrates now became competition among men with armies. There is a kind of sober inevitability in the way the Republic begins to fail, not because failure is simple, but because too many pressures are working at once. Land, debt, patronage, veterans, provincial exploitation, elite rivalry, and constitutional weakness all feed each other. History rarely collapses from a single cause. It wears itself out in layers. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon remains one of the most enduring symbolic moments in political history. The phrase itself has outlived the specific details of the event because it captures something more general, the point of no easy return. A river crossed under such conditions becomes more than geography, it becomes a decision. What followed was civil war, victory, and then another unsettling truth. Caesar, after triumphing, accumulated powers that made many Romans fear the return of kingship under another name. His assassination was meant in part to rescue the Republic, but the Republic was already badly damaged. Removing one man did not restore the old world. Instead, it accelerated the final struggle for control. Octavian, later Augustus, rose from the aftermath with a patience and political skill that contrasted with the more dramatic styles of other leaders. He understood that Rome no longer wanted the visible chaos of repeated civil war. It wanted, or at least could be persuaded to want, peace with structure. This is one of the most fascinating transitions in Roman history. The Republic did not vanish in a single instant. It was gradually repackaged, its language and forms preserved while real power concentrated elsewhere. Augustus would present himself as restorer rather than monarch. That choice was deeply Roman. Even in change, the city preferred continuity in dress. The crisis years are full of speeches, betrayals, alliances, reforms, and public performances of legitimacy. Yet beneath all this noise there remains the same older city, still attached to custom, still conscious of prestige, still trying to say that its institutions matter. Romans were remarkably good at believing that their forms could hold even when reality suggested otherwise. Perhaps they believed this because their history had rewarded endurance so often. The Republic had survived wars, social conflict, and internal division before. Why not now? But the scale of the crisis was different. The Republic had become too powerful for its own earlier restraint. The city itself, meanwhile, continued to change physically. More monuments, more forums, more administrative complexity, more people. The urban landscape became a reflection of political strain and imperial ambition at once. Even the stones seemed to be speaking in more crowded voices. And still, ordinary life ran under the surface of the crisis. Bakers, scribes, labourers, shopkeepers, household servants, and soldiers all moved through a city whose public troubles did not stop the need for bread, water, repair, and sleep. This is worth remembering because the greatest transitions in history are always lived among common routines. Rome in crisis is not only the story of famous men, it is also the story of a society trying to decide whether its old forms can survive its own success. And as the Republic's final decades faded into civil war and the promise of one-man rule began to appear as a solution, if a troubling one, the city entered a new phase. The old Republic would remain in memory, but not in the same way. Something else was coming, quietly and inevitably, into place. Augustus is one of the great turning points in Roman history because he managed to create a new political reality while preserving the language of the old one. He did not present himself as king. That would have been difficult for Romans to accept. Instead, he positioned himself as the first citizen, the princeps, a man whose authority rested on accumulated powers, prestige, and the willingness of others to accept the arrangement. This was a masterful political solution. It acknowledged Roman suspicion of monarchy while allowing for centralized control. The Republic's forms remained visible. Consuls were still elected. The Senate still met. Public offices still existed, but the true balance of power had shifted. In many ways, Augustus gave Rome what it had been asking for through years of civil conflict: peace, not complete peace and not always gentle peace, but a period of order after exhaustion. The doors of war were symbolically closed. The state could breathe. Roads, administration, taxation, and military deployment became more regular. Provinces were managed more consistently. The empire began to feel less like a victory and more like a system. There is a calmness to the Augustan age that comes partly from control, partly from artful presentation. Literature flourished. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and others helped shape a Roman cultural self-image that linked the city's past to a grander future. Poetry in this era did not float above politics, it helped define it. Virgil's Aeneid, in particular, gave Rome a mythic ancestry that connected the city to heroic foundations and divine favor. This was not just literature, it was political memory refined into art. The empire needed a story of destiny, and Augustus' age supplied one. The Augustan building program transformed Rome's appearance. Marble, temples, altars, forums, and public monuments reshaped the city. Augustus is said to have found Rome brick and left it marble, though such a line should be understood as both symbolic and practical. The city became more monumental, more self-conscious, more visibly imperial. And yet, even in this gleaming transformation, the old Roman habit of seriousness remained. Public morality was emphasized, family values were promoted, religious restoration was encouraged. There was a sense that the city needed to be not only powerful, but properly ordered in the moral imagination as well. Of course, imperial order also required surveillance, loyalty, and the management of dissent. The emperor's peace was not the same as freedom, but it was a peace that many people, exhausted by civil war, were willing to live under. This willingness is one of the reasons empires can endure. They offer predictability after chaos. The later Julio-Claudian emperors carried forward Augustus' system with varying degrees of success. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero each reveal different facets of imperial rule. Some were cautious, some were erratic, some were deeply administrative, some became remembered for excess or danger. Their reputations were shaped by politics, propaganda, elite hostility, and later storytelling, but they also reflect the strange pressure of ruling a world in which one man's household could become a matter of empire. Claudius, in particular, is interesting because he shows the administrative side of the Roman state. He was involved in expansion, infrastructure, legal matters, and the ongoing work of government. Emperors were not just symbolic figures. They were deeply entangled with the machinery of rule. The palace and the state gradually blurred. This could create efficiency, but it also created suspicion. When so much depended on one center of power, the city's stability came to rest on personality as much as institution. Rome had built an empire, but now it had to live with the consequences of concentrating so much authority in one place. At the same time, the provinces became more central to the empire's life. Rome was not only the city on the Tiber. It was a connected world of roads, customs houses, military fronts, administrative centers, and local elites who participated in Roman systems. Many people in the empire might rarely visit Rome itself, yet still be deeply shaped by its laws and expectations. This is one of the reasons the empire feels so expansive when viewed calmly. It was not merely a territory conquered by force, it was a network of habits. A way of counting, taxing, governing, and imagining order. Even the emperor's personal lives became part of public meaning. Marriages, heirs, scandals, exiles, and deaths all carried political weight. The imperial family was both private and public in an almost impossible way. No household could be more watched, and still beneath the visibility of power, the city continued its ordinary rhythm. Merchants sold, officials copied, lawyers argued, priests performed, children learned, bathhouses filled, taverns opened, apartments rose and crowded together in the urban fabric. The empire was vast, but Rome was still a lived-in place. The Augustan settlement and the emperors who followed it did not end tension. They simply gave it a different frame. Instead of republic versus republic, the question became how imperial power should be expressed, limited, inherited, defended, and remembered. That question would remain open for centuries. It is easy, when telling the story of Rome, to move from one great ruler or battle to the next, and forget the vast majority of people who actually lived there. Yet the city's real texture emerges most clearly in everyday life. In the homes, Streets, workshops, markets, bathhouses, and shared public spaces where ordinary rhythms made civilization feel continuous. Roman homes varied greatly by class and location. Some families lived in modest apartments, crowded and often noisy, with cooking, sleeping, and storage all compressed into limited space. Others inhabited larger houses with courtyards, domestic shrines, reception rooms, and more room for display. But across these differences, the household remained central. The Roman family was not simply a private emotional unit in the modern sense. It was a legal, social, and religious structure. The father's authority mattered greatly in theory, though actual family life was always more nuanced and negotiated than idealized descriptions suggest. Women managed households, finances, children, and social relationships in ways that were essential to daily stability, even when formal power remained uneven. Children learned by watching. They learned names, duties, gestures, and expectations. They grew up surrounded by stories of ancestors, by the visible marks of status, and by the many practical tasks of urban and rural life. Education, for those who could access it, often involved reading, writing, rhetoric, and moral instruction. But even without formal schooling, Roman life was an education in public form. The streets of Rome were busy and often difficult. Narrow lanes, traffic, crowds, smells, and noise must have shaped the city's atmosphere as much as its monuments did. Upper levels of buildings looked down on the movement below. Vendors called out. Carriers navigated baskets, sacks, and goods. Water had to be fetched, stored, and managed. A city large enough to impress the world is also large enough to make movement complicated. Baths became one of the most remarkable features of Roman urban life. They were not only places for washing, but for conversation, exercise, socializing, and leisure. In them, the empire's love of structure met the human desire for relaxation. One could hear news, arrange meetings, and simply pass time in a setting where bodies and society were both in motion. Food in Rome ranged widely according to wealth and location. Bread was central. Olive oil and wine were important staples. Vegetables, fruit, legumes, cheese, fish, and meats appeared according to means and season. Meals could be simple or elaborate. For many people, the day's food was practical rather than luxurious. Yet food always carried social meaning. Who ate with whom, where, and in what style all mattered. Religion was everywhere in daily life. Households maintained altars. Public festivals marked the calendar. Priests, augurs, and ritual specialists helped interpret the city's relationship to the divine. Temples were not isolated from ordinary routines. They were woven into them. A prayer before a journey, an offering for household safety, a festival procession through the streets. These actions gave the city a sense of rhythm beyond politics. Work also filled the city in countless forms. Craftsmen, builders, bakers, porters, scribes, merchants, administrators, soldiers, and enslaved laborers all contributed to the functioning of the Roman world. The empire's elegance depended on labor that was often invisible or taken for granted. This is another quiet truth of Rome. Splendor rests on repetition. Slavery was an ordinary and painful part of Roman society. Enslaved people worked in homes, farms, workshops, and mines. They had varying experiences depending on their position, but the institution itself was central to the economy and social order. Any honest picture of Rome must hold this fact steadily in view. The city's beauty and organization were built in a world where human bondage was normalized. Public entertainment offered another layer of communal life. Theaters, games, and gladiatorial contests drew crowds and created shared moments of excitement. These events were not merely amusement. They were occasions through which the city expressed hierarchy, power, generosity, and collective identity. A Roman crowd could be entertained, but it was also being taught what Rome valued. Markets and trade linked the city to a wider world. Grain from distant provinces, goods from local artisans, luxury items from far away, all flowed into the urban economy. Rome was a center because it could concentrate exchange. What one person needed or desired often depended on labor and movement far beyond the city walls. There is something comforting, in a historical sense, about attending to these small details. They remind us that the past was not made only of speeches and wars. It was also made of laundry, repairs, recipes, greetings, errands, and the soft repetition of habit. If one had spent a quiet day in Rome, one might have moved from home to street, street to market, market to bath, bath to friend, friend to dinner, dinner to sleep. The city's vastness would have been felt in fragments: a smell from a bakery, a shout from below, the sound of a cart wheel, a glimpse of stone in the evening light. These fragments matter because they fill the spaces between the famous events. They give Rome its human scale, and without human scale, even the grandest empire becomes hard to imagine clearly. So when we think of Rome, it may help to pause here among the everyday things: a doorway opening, a basin of water, a folded tunic, a written message, a meal shared, a lamp lit at dusk. These are not minor details. They are the texture of a civilization lived from day to day. At its height, the Roman Empire felt immense not only because of its territory, but because of its confidence. Roads stretched outward, cities followed Roman forms, law connected provinces, trade linked seas and inland routes. Soldiers guarded frontiers in distant climates and landscapes. The empire was many places at once, yet it could still imagine itself as a whole. Under the so-called five good emperors, especially in the 2nd century, Rome enjoyed a period often remembered as relatively stable and capable. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius each contributed in different ways to this sense of imperial maturity. The label itself is a little neat, as historical labels often are, but it captures something useful. This was a time when the imperial system appeared to function with a degree of balance. Trajan expanded the empire to one of its greatest territorial extents. His reign is often associated with military success, public building, and administrative confidence. Hadrian, by contrast, is remembered more for consolidation, travel, and careful attention to frontiers. The two emperors offer an interesting pair. One reaches outward, the other stabilizes and defines. Hadrian's wall in Britain stands as a particularly clear symbol of Roman thought. It was not merely a barrier, it was a statement of measured control. Here, the empire said, is the edge we intend to hold. Not every frontier was absolute, but the wall expresses a Roman instinct to make borders visible and manageable. Rome itself at this time was no longer the only center of the Roman world in any practical sense. Provincial cities, military capitals, and administrative hubs all mattered, yet Rome remained the emotional and symbolic center. People spoke of it as the city, as though the rest of the empire existed in relation to it. That centrality was reinforced by monumental architecture. The Colosseum, temples, basilicas, forums, baths, arches, columns, and statues created an urban landscape of immense visual authority. But these structures were not only beautiful, they encoded power. They turned imperial order into stone and sight. The Colosseum, in particular, stands as one of the most recognizable Roman structures because it combines spectacle and organization. It speaks of crowds, performance, and state-sponsored entertainment. It is a monument to leisure, but also to hierarchy and control. The seating arrangement alone reflects a social world carefully ordered. Marcus Aurelius is remembered both as emperor and philosopher, a figure whose meditations suggest an inward seriousness that contrasts with the outer machinery of empire. His writings endure because they capture a mind trying to keep moral balance amid responsibility, war, and uncertainty. That inward voice has helped later readers imagine Rome as not only a political system, but a philosophical landscape. Yet even a capable emperor could not fully prevent broader pressures from building. A vast empire is always vulnerable to distance. Communication takes time. Frontiers require constant attention. Local crises can spread. Successive generations inherit not only power but maintenance, and maintenance is the unglamorous core of empire. Roads must be repaired, troops paid, grain moved, laws administered, officials supervised, water systems kept functioning, ports kept open. In a calm moment, an empire may appear self-sustaining. In reality, it is always being held together by work. Roman provinces adapted to the empire in local ways. Some places became deeply Romanized in language, style, and civic design. Others retained more of their older customs while still fitting into Roman administrative patterns. The empire was never uniform in a simple sense. It was a mosaic held together by the expectation of Roman order. Religious life also became more diverse over time. Traditional Roman gods continue to be honored, but new cults, philosophies, and local traditions circulated through the imperial world. People sought meaning in many forms. Some looked to older civic religion, others to mystery cults, others to philosophical schools, others to new spiritual movements that would later become much more historically significant. This diversity reminds us that Rome was not frozen. It was always taking in currents from elsewhere. Even at its height, it remained open to change through contact. There is a certain quiet grandeur in imagining an empire at peace with itself, even if that peace is partial. The roads are full, the harbors busy, the cities ordered, the libraries stocked, the baths warm, the forums active, the provinces speaking many languages under a shared political frame. But the very scale of this world makes it fragile. Great systems are often more delicate than they appear. The more connections they have, the more points of strain they carry. Still, for a time, Rome gave the impression of solidity. Its laws, monuments, armies, and administrative habits seemed capable of lasting indefinitely. That impression itself mattered. Civilizations depend not only on strength, but on the belief that strength will continue. And so the height of Rome is also a height of confidence. A city that can imagine itself as permanent is already thinking in a different register from the village by the river where it began. Yet, if one listens carefully, the old river city is still there inside the empire. The same instincts for order, adaptation, and endurance remain, only enlarged beyond recognition. Even at its most impressive, the Roman Empire remained vulnerable to the ordinary burdens that attend large systems. Distance, succession, military cost, inflation, internal rivalry, frontier pressure, and administrative complexity all made stability difficult to maintain forever. The later empire is therefore not a sudden decline, but a long season of adjustment under stress. This period can be understood best not as a collapse from glory into ruin, but as a series of attempts to respond to changing conditions. Roman rulers, officials, generals, and administrators kept trying to solve immediate problems. Some solutions worked for a while, others shifted the difficulty elsewhere. This is how institutions often survive. They do not escape pressure, they adapt to it. The crisis of the 3rd century was especially severe. Emperors rose and fell quickly. Military loyalty mattered intensely. Borders were challenged. Internal competition became dangerous. The empire's coherence was still present but strained. Looking at this era slowly, one sees not just chaos, but the effort required to keep a huge political body from fragmenting completely. Diocletian's reforms aimed to address this scale problem. By reorganizing imperial authority, making administration more complex, and strengthening provincial control, he sought to give the empire a more durable framework. Rome, by this point, no longer relied on the old simple image of one city ruling all. It needed systems that could match its own size. Constantine then marked another major shift, both politically and religiously. His rule associated the empire more openly with Christianity, a development that would eventually alter the spiritual and cultural character of the Roman world in profound ways. This change did not happen all at once, nor did it erase older traditions overnight. Rather, it added a new center of gravity. The founding of Constantinople, the Eastern imperial capital, reflected the empire's geographic and administrative realities. Rome remained important, but the imperial world had grown too large to orbit only one city. The center had multiplied. This is one of the most interesting things about late Rome. It was still Rome, and yet not only Rome. It was increasingly Eastern in practical weight, increasingly Christian in religious identity, and increasingly divided in administrative focus. But it remained Roman in law, memory, and institutional habit. Late antiquity can sound like a time of loss, but it was also a time of transformation. Urban life continued in many places. Christian communities developed architecture, ritual, and theology. Imperial law evolved. Cultural expression changed. The old and the new overlapped in ways that are easier to see in retrospect than to live through. As the Western Empire weakened, some regions experienced insecurity, political fragmentation, and reduced central control. Yet even here, the idea of Rome persisted. The city was more than a political unit. It had become an inherited framework for legitimacy, learning, law, and identity. This persistence is visible in language and memory. Long after the Western imperial government was no longer functioning as before, people still spoke of Roman authority, Roman law, Roman tradition, and Roman civilization. In that sense, Rome did not end cleanly. It dispersed into successor worlds. The old city itself continued to live, though changed. Christian basilicas rose, pagan temples declined in significance or were repurposed. Public spaces shifted meaning. The city of emperors became in time a city of bishops, pilgrims, aristocrats, and remembered grandeur. Ruin and continuity sat side by side. And if one were to walk through Rome imaginatively in its later centuries, one might feel the strange coexistence of ages. A forum still standing but quieter, a temple altered, a basilica bustling with new devotion, a road still carrying traffic, a wall still useful, a statue long after its political age had passed. This layered quality is part of what makes Rome such a restful subject to listen to slowly. It is always becoming something else without fully leaving itself behind. By the time the Western Empire formally ended in 476, the event was more symbolic than absolute. Power had already been changing shape for generations. Still, the date became a marker because humans like markers, especially for very long changes. It gives a name to a process too broad to grasp all at once. What followed in the Western Mediterranean was not the disappearance of Roman influence, but its reconfiguration. Germanic kingdoms, the Eastern Empire, the Church, local elites, and surviving Roman legal traditions all carried pieces of the old world forward. Rome had not so much vanished as divided into legacies. This is perhaps the gentlest way to understand the later empire, not as a simple ending, but as a fading into different kinds of continuity. A civilization does not always die the way a person dies. Sometimes it becomes heritage, language, habit, law, architecture, and memory. And so the later empire, with all its pressures, can be seen as a bridge, a long bridge. One side reaching back to the river city and the Republic, the other opening into medieval and Byzantine worlds that would inherit, reinterpret, and preserve many Roman forms. The empire changed, the world changed, and Rome in all its forms kept moving through history like a deep current under different surfaces. When we step back from the long story of Rome, what remains is not only conquest or decline, not only emperors or wars, but a set of habits that proved extraordinarily durable. Law, road building, urban design, public administration, formal politics, architectural ambition, a taste for order, record, and ceremony. These things travelled far beyond the life of the city itself. Rome also left behind a quieter inheritance, the idea that a city can become a world, the idea that institutions matter because they outlast individuals, the idea that stories of origin, whether fully true or not, can shape public identity for centuries. The idea that ordinary life, repeated steadily, is one of the real foundations of history. Perhaps that is the most soothing way to leave the subject tonight. Rome was immense, but it was also made of small, repeatable things: a road laid with care, a law spoken aloud, a meal taken after work, a name remembered, a wall repaired, a prayer offered, a child learning the shape of a city from the example of those who came before. And if one listens closely to the whole story, from the river settlement to the republic, from the republic to the empire, from empire to memory, one hears not just power but endurance. Rome kept changing, and in changing it became one of the most enduring names in human history. So now let the city recede gently. Let the forums grow quiet, the roads empty, the river return to its calm movement in the dark. The story can rest here for tonight, still present, still layered, but no longer asking to be followed any further. And as you settle into sleep, may the long life of Rome soften into a distant rhythm, like footsteps fading down a stone street, and then into silence. Yet even in silence, Rome lingers in the imagination in small, almost tender ways. A cracked column catching moonlight, a Latin inscription half worn away by rain, the outline of an aqueduct crossing a valley long after the city that built it has gone to dust. These are not only ruins. They are pauses in time, and they invite a slower kind of attention. It is easy, when thinking about Rome, to imagine loudness. Crowds, speeches, armies, triumphs, processions, political tension, ambition, and the long echo of empire. But beneath that public noise there was always an ordinary city, and beneath the ordinary city there was the ancient human habit of living one day at a time. People fetched water, mended cloth, argued over money, visited relatives, grieved, celebrated, prayed, and slept. History tends to keep the grand events, but it is the repeated ordinary things that make a civilization feel real. In the Republic especially, much of Rome's character came from the belief that public life mattered deeply. Offices had names, duties had shapes, magistrates entered and left with ceremony. Elections, even when constrained by wealth and status, gave the city a ritual of participation. The Republic was never simple democracy in the later sense, but it did create a strong sense that political life was something visible, structured, and shared. That shared life depended heavily on reputation. Roman families remembered their ancestors. Masks of the dead were kept. Funerals could become public lessons in lineage and service. To a Roman aristocrat, one's name was almost a living thing, carrying obligations from one generation to the next. In such a world, politics was never entirely separate from memory. Men acted not only for themselves, but under the gaze of earlier Romans, imagined or real. This is one of the quiet fascinations of Rome. It constantly looked backward while moving forward. Even when it conquered new lands, it often dressed itself in the language of old customs. Even when it changed its institutions, it preferred to do so in forms that seemed to preserve tradition. Romans were often conservative in method, even when the substance was transforming around them. The Republic's gradual expansion beyond Italy brought still more complexity. Provinces had different needs, different histories, different levels of integration. Some cities were given privileges. Some communities retained local traditions under Roman oversight. Some places became deeply Romanized, while others stayed distinct for centuries. The empire, in this sense, was not only a map of conquest. It was a patchwork of agreements, taxes, loyalties, and local identities. One can imagine, in a quiet moment, a traveler moving through that world. A road smooth beneath sandals, milestones standing at intervals, inns at dusk, farms beyond the roadside, a small shrine beside a turn in the path. The traveler might move from one legal world to another, one dialect to another, one pattern of worship to another, yet still recognize the broad Roman order that held these differences together. Roads are practical things, but in an empire they become symbols too. They say that distant places belong to the same network of expectation. The Roman road system was one of those achievements that appears almost simple until one thinks about its scale. Straight stretches where possible, careful drainage, layers of packed material, bridges, cuttings through hills. The roads were not built with romance in mind, yet they became romantic in hindsight because they enabled so much movement. Soldiers marched on them, merchants used them, messengers carried news. Pilgrims, officials, tax collectors, and ordinary families all traveled along these lines. A road is a kind of sentence written across the land. And while the roads tied the empire together, the sea did something equally important. The Mediterranean was not merely a boundary, it was a route. Grain ships, wine ships, olive oil, marble, clay amphorae, letters, and people crossed its waters continually. The Romans called it, in effect, their sea, and in doing so they understood something fundamental. Water can divide, but it can also connect more efficiently than land. Ports became meeting points of language, scent, trade, and rumor. The Mediterranean world was also deeply seasonal. Winds mattered, harvests mattered, sailing windows mattered. So much of Roman power rested on practical rhythms that no decree could fully command. Grain had to arrive on time. Bad weather could delay an army. Poor harvests could strain cities. The empire seemed enormous, but its daily life still depended on the timing of weather and the patience of administrators. This makes the Roman story feel less like a rigid machine and more like a living organism. It grew, adjusted, sometimes overreached and sometimes healed. Its institutions were not immortal, but they were remarkably adaptable. A census, for instance, was more than a number. It was a way of seeing the population. Taxation relied on record-keeping. Military recruitment depended on categories. Citizenship itself became more and more expansive over time, eventually extending far beyond the original city-state. In the 3rd century CE, when nearly all free inhabitants of the empire were granted citizenship, the meaning of being Roman changed profoundly. It became less a privilege of a narrow civic class and more a civil identity spread across a vast realm. That widening of identity is one of the most interesting transformations in the whole story. At first, Rome was a city with allies, then a city with Italy, then Italy with provinces, then an empire with a Roman name. The name remained, but its meaning broadened. To be Roman could mean one thing to a senator in the old capital, another to a merchant in North Africa, another to a soldier on the Rhine, and another to a lawyer in Antioch or Alexandria. This variety is part of Rome's long afterlife. It never stayed one thing for long. The Republic's end, too, can be seen as a process rather than a moment. Civil wars did not appear all at once. They accumulated from competition, fear, ambition, and the strain of governing a huge expanse with old political habits. When men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Antony, and Octavian rose to prominence, they were not inventing tension from nothing. They were moving through a system already stretched by success. Expansion had made greatness possible, but it had also made old balances unstable. There is something almost tragic in the way a city can outgrow the political forms that once made it strong. The Roman Republic had been designed in part for a much smaller Italy-centered world. It was a framework of checks, offices, custom, and elite competition. But once Rome became the center of far-flung provinces, immense wealth, long campaigns, and professional armies, the old system became hard to sustain. What had once been a strength became a limitation. What had once balanced ambition began to feed it. Still, the Romans rarely experienced their own history as a simple collapse. Many likely saw the struggles of their age as temporary disorder, a crisis to be resolved, a matter of which family, law, or leader would restore proper balance. Human beings usually live inside their transitions without knowing their final shape. They do not often say, "I am living at the end of a republic." They say instead that times are difficult, that the old ways are under pressure, that perhaps order will return if only the right person emerges. Octavian understood this well. He was young, patient, calculating, and unusually skilled at appearing restrained. After the chaos of Caesar's assassination and the subsequent wars, he presented himself not as a revolutionary, but as a restorer. This was politically brilliant. Romans were deeply attached to the language of renewal through tradition. Octavian's genius lay in preserving the forms people recognized while making their underlying meaning serve a new reality. Augustus, as he became known, stands at the threshold of a new age not because he announced an empire in dramatic fashion, but because he carefully arranged one under republican vocabulary. The Senate still existed, offices still existed, elections still existed, yet real power flowed through one man's authority, military control, and political prestige. It was an elegant transformation, and perhaps because it was elegant, it lasted. One may imagine the first emperor walking through restored temples, public spaces, and family monuments, making the city look both ancient and newly ordered. Augustus was famously attentive to imagery. He understood that architecture and inscription could communicate political messages without the need for constant force. He wanted Rome to appear restored, morally serious, and continuous with its better past. In that sense, the city itself became part of the imperial argument. The Augustan age is often remembered for its poets as well. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and others wrote within a world of changed power, and their work carries the atmosphere of transition. Virgil's Aeneid, especially, reaches backward into myth to give Rome a noble and fated origin. It tells of Aeneas, the weary survivor of Troy, carrying his household gods through loss toward a future not yet visible. It is a poem full of duty, sorrow, destiny, and sacrifice. Quietly, it transforms imperial Rome into the fulfillment of ancient wandering. Myth in Rome was never merely decorative. It helped the city explain itself. Romulus and Remus, the she-wolf, the abduction of the Sabine women, the noble sacrifice of early heroes, the steadfastness of matronly virtue, the endurance of the Republic's founders, the imagined descent from Trojan ancestors, all of these stories formed a symbolic landscape. They told Romans who they were, or at least who they wished to be. Myths can be more durable than facts because they answer emotional needs facts alone cannot satisfy. The later emperors inherited this atmosphere of sacred history and practical administration together. They ruled not as gods in a full sense, though some claimed divine honors after death and sometimes even during life, but as visible centers of a system that relied on ceremony. The imperial court developed its own rhythms. Petitioners waited, officials managed archives, generals reported victories, envoys arrived from distant lands. The emperor's face appeared on coins and statues, a constant reminder of order spread across enormous distances. Coins themselves are a restful thing to consider in their way, small, portable, repeated everywhere. A coin can travel through dozens of hands and many miles. It may carry an emperor's portrait, a victory scene, a deity, a grain emblem, a ship, a temple, or a personification of peace. In a world without printing presses or electronic screens, coinage was one of the most frequent visual messages a person encountered. It was intimate, practical, and political all at once. Some Roman emperors were capable administrators. Some were deeply flawed, some were brief, some were long-lived. Some are remembered mainly because the stories about them are vivid. Nero, Domitian, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, Diocletian, Constantine, each belongs to a different atmosphere, a different century, a different set of expectations. It can be tempting to treat emperors as symbols, but they were also individuals constrained by the immense structure around them. A ruler in Rome was never only a person. He was an office, a ritual, a projection, and a focus for hopes and fears. The imperial period widened the sense of what Roman culture could be. Cities across the provinces built forums, baths, theatres, amphitheatres, temples, arches, and villas modelled on Roman forms, though often adapted to local taste. In North Africa, Spain, Gaul, Britain, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, Roman life mingled with older traditions. Latin and Greek coexisted in complicated ways. Local deities were identified with Roman ones. New cults moved along trade routes. Soldiers carried customs from one frontier to another. The empire was held together not by sameness, but by layered similarity. Baths are especially revealing in this regard. They were public, social, practical, and leisurely spaces. Warm rooms, steam, exercise areas, cool plunges, conversation, reading, gossip, and small rituals of the body all existed together there. A bath complex could be one of the most democratic-feeling places in a Roman city, though still shaped by social rank. It is easy to picture the soft echo of water in stone halls, the changing air from hot to cool, the smell of oils, and the low murmur of daily life. Baths remind us that Roman civilization was not built only on war and law, but also on maintenance, comfort, and repeated routines. Beneath the grand public world, household religion remained important. The domestic shrine, the hearth, the household gods, and ancestor memory gave Roman life a personal scale. Families asked for protection in the home, even while the state made sacrifices on behalf of the community. This domestic dimension softened the hardness of empire. It kept the cosmic and the intimate near each other. A citizen might speak of Jupiter on the Capitol, and also of small gods guarding a doorway or pantry. Ancient religion was often less a single system than a mosaic of concerns, places, and relationships. Rome also knew how to absorb foreign gods without fully dissolving them. Isis, Mithras, Cybele, Sol Invictus, and many local divinities found followers in Roman territory. Some cults were mysterious, with initiation and hidden symbolism. Others were public and familiar. Religious life in the empire was broad enough to hold contradictions for a long time. People could be loyal to local shrines and also participate in imperial rituals. They could see divine favor in omens, dreams, animal behavior, celestial events, and patterns of luck. The Roman imagination was, in many ways, a patient one. It accepted the possibility that the world carried signs not immediately obvious. This is one reason Roman literature and religion remain so quietly absorbing. They preserve a world in which the visible and invisible were close together. A bird flying at the wrong moment could alter a decision. An eclipse might suggest unease. A dream might be treated as meaningful. A general could hesitate before battle because of a ritual concern. A household might keep its little idols near food and flame. Modern minds often separate practical life from symbolic life more sharply, but Rome kept them braided together. In the city itself, the physical landscape reflected that braided quality. The Capitol rose as a political and religious center. The Forum gathered law, commerce, memory, and civic ritual. The Palatine acquired imperial residences and elite houses. Markets hummed with transaction. Workshops made pots, tools, cloth, and metal goods. Inscribed stones marked tombs, altars, dedications, and public honors. Everywhere there was the sense of layers. One building replaced another. One monument leaned on the memory of an older one. One age stood directly on the remains of a prior age. Excavation in modern Rome often reveals this layering in surprising ways. A church stands above a Roman temple. A palace rests on earlier walls. A stairway leads to a level that was once ground. The city is almost like a geological formation of human intention. One can descend through centuries by walking a few steps. That is one reason the city feels so strangely alive even in ruins. It is not a single preserved moment. It is many moments held together. Across the empire, however, the pressures of administration never disappeared. The wider the territory, the more the center depended on information moving reliably. Governors sent reports. Tax assessments were collected. Military commands were coordinated. Supply chains were monitored. In periods of stability, all of this could seem almost effortless from the outside. In periods of strain, the fragility became clearer. The empire's greatness contained its own burden, the distance between decision and arrival. The 3rd century CE brought severe difficulty. Emperors came and went quickly. External pressures intensified. Internal conflicts multiplied. The economy experienced stress. Frontier zones required urgent attention. In such a climate, the imperial structure proved resilient but visibly strained. It adapted through stronger bureaucracy, regional command, monetary reform, and military reorganization. Rome did not simply unravel, it changed shape to survive, and yet survival often looks from a distance like decay. A system that becomes more hierarchical may appear less graceful than before. A city that becomes more fortified may seem less free. A court that grows more ceremonial may seem less republican, but these changes can also be read as practical responses to scale and danger. The Romans, at their best and worst, were very serious about order. When the old order became insufficient, they built a new one. Diocletian's reforms are particularly revealing in this regard. He divided power, strengthened administration, and tried to bring the empire under a more stable framework. Constantine later continued to transform imperial life, and his founding of Constantinople shifted the center of gravity eastward in lasting ways. The eastern half of the empire would endure far longer than the western. This is important to remember when speaking of the fall of Rome. Often what fell was the Western imperial structure, while Roman authority, culture, law, and identity persisted in the East in a different form. The Byzantine world, as later historians would call it, carried Roman continuity into new centuries. Its emperors were Roman emperors. Its legal traditions remained Roman. Its cities, churches, diplomacy, and court culture inherited the old imperial grammar and translated it into new idioms. The East preserved things the West could no longer maintain at the same scale. That too is part of Rome's long story. It split, but one half remained astonishingly alive. Meanwhile, in the West, local powers filled the spaces left by imperial contraction. Some Germanic rulers adopted Roman titles, laws, and administrative practices. Cities persisted, though often more modestly. Bishops became important civic figures. Monasteries preserved literacy and memory. The Latin language evolved into regional forms that would one day become French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and others. Roman roads, wall lines, legal concepts, and settlement patterns quietly shaped medieval Europe long after the empire's political center had moved on. The transformation of language is one of the slowest and most beautiful forms of historical change. Latin did not vanish. It softened, fractured, survived in books, rituals, inscriptions, and speech. A word could carry a memory across 1,000 years without anyone noticing the full path it had traveled. The same is true of many Roman legacies. We inherit them in altered form and often forget their origin. Even calendars, names of months, legal terms, architectural forms, and civic habits still echo Rome in subtle ways. As night deepens, one might picture these layers as sediment: the Republic beneath the Empire beneath the medieval city, the medieval city beneath the modern capital, the modern capital built among shattered columns, reused stones, and streets that still trace ancient choices. History is rarely clean. It is often accumulated. It rests on what came before, even when it appears to have moved far away from it. There is also something poignant about the fact that so much Roman achievement was practical rather than glamorous. Drainage systems, sewers, aqueducts, warehouses, fortifications, ports, tax records, bridge foundations. The empire's endurance depended on this uncelebrated labor. A civilization is not only its senators, generals, and emperors. It is also its engineers, surveyors, masons, clerks, dockworkers, farmers, and household servants. Rome knew this, at least implicitly, because it valued infrastructure as an expression of order. The aqueducts in particular seem almost dreamlike now, water moving across landscapes by carefully maintained gradient, arriving in cisterns, baths, fountains, and homes. The Romans understood that the control of water was also a control of urban possibility. A city with dependable water could grow more densely, more cleanly, more confidently. Fountains were not merely decorative, they were signs that the city could sustain itself. Even now, a broken aqueduct in the countryside has a melancholy beauty, as if someone once drew a line of confidence across the land and left it behind for the sky to keep. In literature, Rome often appears as both fate and memory. Poets and historians return to its founding, its republic, its wars, its virtues, its corruption, and its transformations because the city seemed to crystallize so many human themes: ambition and restraint, duty and desire, public honor and private compromise, continuity and change. No single story contains it all, which is perhaps why Rome remains endlessly revisitable. It is not one lesson, but many overlapping ones. The mythic founders of Rome were especially useful to later generations because they linked the city to the broader Mediterranean world. Aeneas came from Troy, crossing Los into new foundations. Romulus and Remus emerged from a story of abandonment, survival, and contested inheritance. The Republic's heroes were often imagined as stern, disciplined, and self-sacrificing. Such stories offered moral examples, but they also allowed Romans to envision themselves as part of a much older drama. They were not just inhabitants of a city, they were heirs to destiny, yet the most enduring memory of Rome may be its tension between grandeur and fragility. The city seemed permanent because it was so vast, but it was always vulnerable to human weakness, external pressure, and the changing fortunes of power. It built for eternity and still changed with each generation. It legislated with confidence and still had to revise its own structures. It conquered many peoples and still absorbed their customs. It projected stability while living through repeated instability. That paradox is perhaps why Rome remains comforting to contemplate in a sleepy, reflective mood. It reminds us that change is normal, even in the most imposing systems. It reminds us that empires, like lives, unfold in phases. A beginning can be humble, a rise can be gradual, a peak can be complicated, a decline can be partial, uneven, and transformed by survival. Nothing has only one shape forever. If one were to walk slowly through the Roman story after midnight, one might begin at the river crossing on the Palatine, then move through the Age of Kings, the founding of the Republic, the expansion across Italy, the struggle with Carthage, the flowering and crisis of the Middle Republic, the civil wars, Augustus, careful restoration, the age of imperial consolidation, the severe 3rd century, the late antique transformations, and the long survival of Roman identity in new forms. Such a walk would not need urgency. Each period could unfold like a landscape passed gently in the dark. And perhaps the most restful thought of all is that Rome, despite everything, never entirely belongs to the past. Its roads became the lines of later movement. Its laws became the basis of later legal systems. Its languages evolved into new speech. Its coins, ruins, manuscripts, and stories still surface in museums, books, and excavations. Even its losses have left traces that can be followed with patience. A civilization can vanish politically and still remain culturally present for a very long time. It can end as a state and continue as a memory. It can lose its center and still shape the edge. It can fall in one sense and yet stand in another for centuries afterward. So the city remains not as it was, but as layers of thought, stone, law, and imagination. The Republic's proud voices fade into the imperial hush. The imperial hush gives way to the distant bells of later centuries. Temples become churches, forums become fields of scattered marble, palaces become ruins, yet the shape of Rome persists in the mind like a half-remembered dream, detailed enough to feel real, softened enough to invite rest. And now, as the long story settles, let it do so without strain. Let the triumphs and troubles, the Senate and the army, the Republic and the Empire, the laws and the legends, all drift into a deeper quiet. The river flows on, the stones remain, and the names move gently into history. In that quiet, Rome is no longer asking to be won, governed, defended, or explained. It is simply there, layered and distant, like a city seen from far away under calm night sky. And if sleep comes slowly, it may come with the same old softness that rests on ancient walls after the last light has gone. There is in the Roman story a kind of twilight that never fully ends. Even after the Republic has given way, even after emperors have worn the purple and legions have marched across the known world, the older city remains present in memory like a faint lamp behind a curtain. The names change, the offices change, the burdens of power change, yet some ancient habits of mind continue to move beneath the surface. Romans still speak of duty, honor, ancestry, law, and fate. They still measure themselves against the long shadow of their own beginnings. It is easy to picture Rome as a single rising line, from village to kingdom to republic to empire, but real history is more like a patient weaving. Threads cross and return. Old customs survive inside new institutions. Rustic religious rites remain beside political ambition. Private family devotion sits quietly under public display. The city that would command the Mediterranean never entirely forgets the little rites of the hearth. In a house at dawn, a household may honor the Lares, the protective spirits of place and family, while the state beyond the threshold prepares to govern provinces, tax harvests, and settle disputes in distant courts. The scale changes, yet the human center remains intimate. This is part of the peculiar comfort of Rome. It is so large in memory that it can seem abstract, but it was lived by people who worried about weather, inherited debt, public reputation, illness, and the uncertain affection of relatives. Senators could be magnificent in public and anxious in private. Soldiers could march beneath standards carrying ancient symbols while missing home. Merchants could calculate the price of grain and wonder whether storms would spare their ships. Slaves, freedpersons, laborers, priests, craftsmen, and children all moved through the same city, each with a different horizon of hope and constraint. The empire was not one experience, but many overlapping lives. And beneath those lives was a city built from layers, each generation resting on the work of the one before it. Rome itself was famous for this accumulation. A temple rebuilt after fire, a road laid over an older path, a forum widened by a new victory, a triumphal arch raised to celebrate a commander who now belongs to the past. The city became an archive in stone. To walk through it, even in imagination, is to pass through time not as a straight corridor but as a series of rooms, each partly open to the next. There is something almost dreamlike in the way Roman history keeps revealing earlier versions of itself. The Republic begins with a story of expelled kings, yet the old reverence for hierarchy and ritual never disappears. The late Republic speaks in the language of liberty, yet it is shadowed by extraordinary commands, personal armies, and violent public uncertainty. The Empire promises peace, yet that peace rests on the careful management of force. The phrase Pax Romana suggests stillness, but it is the stillness of a great mechanism that continues to move. Rivers of trade, messages, tribute, grain, and orders travel under the calm surface. One can imagine an afternoon in the city during the Augustan age. The air is warm, marble glows softly, a fountain makes a measured sound in a shaded courtyard. Somewhere nearby, a scribe copies lines of poetry, elsewhere a magistrate receives visitors, elsewhere still, a vendor arranges fruit in a basket, and a child watches pigeons pick at fallen grain. This is Rome at its most ordinary and perhaps most enduring, not only the seat of empire, but a place where ordinary gestures continue around the edges of power. Great states are made from such repeated small acts, and when they dissolve, the small acts often remain. The Republic, so often admired for its sternness, was never free of contradiction. Its ideal of citizenship was noble but limited. Its famous competitions for office allowed brilliant men to rise, but also encouraged rivalry that could become dangerous. Its public language praised self-control, yet its politics often depended on persuasion, patronage, and reputation. Senators claimed to serve the common good while protecting their own standing. The Roman word dignitas carried not only prestige but weight, a social gravity that a man was expected to maintain. To lose it was more than embarrassment, it was a kind of dimming. And yet Romans were deeply aware of the fragility beneath their own ideals. Their literature is full of memory, warning, and reflection. They looked back to ancestors not merely out of pride, but because the past seemed to offer a difficult education. The stories of Lucretia, of Horatius at the bridge, of the self-sacrificing Decius, of Cincinnatus called from the plough, all belong to a moral landscape in which public virtue is imagined as costly and rare. Whether these episodes are exact in every detail matters less than the fact that they were cherished. They helped Romans think about themselves. They gave shape to the idea that history could be instructive, not just impressive. At the same time, Rome was practical in a way that often escapes romantic descriptions. It surveyed land, it organized grain shipments, it recorded taxes, it standardized measures, it sent legal authority along roads that remained useful long after the original orders had been forgotten. The famous Roman roads, so often pictured in the mind as perfect lines across the continent, were in truth works of maintenance as much as construction. They were repaired, extended, and used again and again. They connected barracks, markets, villas, and towns. To follow them mentally is to imagine not conquest alone, but administration, patience, and continuity. Even Rome's military machine, immense as it was, depended on routine. Camps were laid out with care. Marches followed schedules. Equipment had to be issued, mended, carried, and accounted for. Legionary discipline became legendary not because every moment was glorious, but because so much of it was repetitive. The daily life of a soldier could be full of dust and waiting. In the distance there were frontiers, and beyond them unfamiliar peoples, forests, mountains, and other languages. Yet the army also brought Roman order to places that had known their own older orders for centuries. Some welcomed it, some resisted it, and many adapted to it in ways that left mixed and lasting traces. The expansion of Rome across Italy and beyond was never just a march of force. It was also a gradual drawing of regions into a widening civic world. Allies became subjects. Subjects became citizens, eventually in more inclusive and complicated forms. Local elites learned Roman habits while retaining local identities. Temples to native gods stood beside shrines to Roman deities. Latin spread, but not everywhere in the same way and not all at once. The Mediterranean world under Rome became remarkably connected, yet it remained varied, filled with accents, customs, cuisines, and memories of older sovereignties. There is a quiet mystery in that diversity. We can map the empire on parchment and in our minds, but the lived experience of it is harder to recover. What did it feel like to move from one province to another, carrying letters and goods through ports and way stations, hearing unfamiliar speech in the streets, seeing Roman symbols become ordinary in one place and imposing in another? What did it mean to be a provincial in a city where power had many centers and one visible heart? Archaeology gives fragments, inscriptions, household objects, coins, bones, traces of dye, charred grain, worn steps. These are small surviving witnesses, and because they are small, they feel intimate. Rome's religious life also had this layered quality. The traditional gods were honored with exacting care, but foreign cults entered the city and found devotees. Mystery religions promised deeper personal bonds to the divine. The cult of the emperor in varying forms joined politics and reverence in ways that could be both sincere and strategic. Sacred space did not stand still, it adapted. A deity from one region might find a home in another. A temple could be rebuilt after fire or reinterpreted under new rule. Romans were not always tolerant in the modern sense, but they were often absorbent. Their religion, like their politics, could gather more than one thing at once. In this way, Rome became a civilization of incorporation. It absorbed gods, peoples, art, coins, ideas, and stories. It borrowed from the Greeks, adapted from the Etruscans, and learned from every border it touched. Yet it also insisted on its own identity with almost stubborn seriousness. The Romans were eager students and exacting teachers. They admired Greek sculpture, philosophy, and literature while claiming a different strength: practical governance, military endurance, and legal form. It is a familiar human pattern, this mixture of admiration and self-assertion. Civilizations learn by borrowing, then make the borrowed thing feel inevitable. The Roman household offers another quiet window into that world. A house was not merely a shelter, it was a social and symbolic center. It held ancestry in its portraits and masks. It displayed wealth through mosaics, painted walls, and courtyards. It protected the family's daily life while also staging its status for visitors. Some homes were modest and crowded, others were spacious, with gardens and fountains designed to suggest leisure even in a busy city. The domestic sphere was shaped by hierarchy, yet also by affection, discipline, routine, and grief. A room could contain memory as surely as a monument. Funerary customs perhaps show this most gently. Romans devoted great attention to the dead. Tombs lined roads outside the city. Inscriptions tried to preserve names, ages, relationships, virtues, and lament. Some are brief, some are almost tender in their plainness. A stone might record that a daughter was missed, a husband mourned, a friend remembered. Great public funerals of nobles dramatized lineage and political standing, but the quieter grave of ordinary people also speak across the centuries. They remind us that Roman civilization was inhabited by the bereaved as much as by the ambitious. There is also the strange endurance of myth within history. Rome did not simply replace legend with record. It often used legend to illuminate record. The story of Aeneas traveling from fallen Troy to a future Italy gave Rome a noble prehistory, linking it to the world of Homer and to the grief of displacement. In that tale, destruction becomes beginning. A city falls elsewhere, and a new city is destined somewhere else. The myth is beautiful partly because it is sorrowful. It suggests that great civilizations are often born from loss, and that memory of catastrophe can be transformed into origin. The story of Romulus and Remus, with its wolf, its exposure, its fratricidal ending, feels similarly symbolic. It is not a simple fairy tale. It is a meditation on foundings. Rome begins with kinship and violence intertwined, with nurture and rivalry, with divine favor and human blood. A city founded in such a way can later interpret its history as a sequence of contests among brothers, cousins, factions, and rival futures. The myth does not merely entertain. It haunts the political imagination. When Romans watched civil war tear their state apart, they were not just experiencing crisis. They were reliving a founding pattern in darker form. That may be one reason the final century of the Republic feels so charged and so sorrowful. The old political forms remain, but their meanings strain under pressure. Ambitious men command armies loyal to them personally, not only to the state. Public violence becomes more common. Reform is needed, but every reform seems to awaken fear. Property, citizenship, and authority are all in motion. The Republic, once imagined as balanced and durable, reveals how much it had depended on habit and restraint. When those weaken, the structure trembles. And yet the end was not sudden in a simple sense. It came by stages. A dictator meant to restore order instead unsettled it further. Alliances formed and dissolved. Names that once belonged to collaborators became names of enemies. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and that famous action has become almost too familiar in memory, but its meaning is still quietly astonishing. A river crossing became a point of no return. The Republic's language of law confronted the irreversibility of force. After that, history moved with a different cadence. It was still Roman, but no longer republican in the older sense. Augustus understood this better than many of his contemporaries. He did not present himself as a king in the old style. He clothed his power in restoration, moderation, and civic vocabulary. He preserved forms while changing substance. Offices remained. The Senate remained. Elections remained, though altered. The emperor's genius lay not simply in conquest, but in arrangement. He made personal rule appear like recovered order. He made a new political reality feel ancient enough to endure. It was a masterwork of continuity and disguise. Under Augustus and his successors, Rome entered a period of greater calm, though never complete calm. and certainly not uniform happiness. The poets of the age could praise peace while sensing its costs. Virgil's Aeneid looks backward to Troy and forward to Rome, gathering grief and destiny into a single flowing narrative. Horace writes with a measured confidence that can feel like sunlight on a polished floor. Livy turns the Republic's past into a moral panorama. These voices do not merely celebrate empire, they also give it depth, sadness, and reflection. They make greatness seem inseparable from loss. Imperial Rome was astonishingly cosmopolitan for its time. In the city itself, one could hear many accents and see people from across the sea. Emperors came from Italy, but also from Spain, Africa, Syria, and elsewhere. This widening of Roman identity is one of the quieter marvels of antiquity. The center did not remain ethnically or culturally fixed. It expanded, absorbed, and redefined itself. The idea of Rome became larger than the walls of Rome. That expansion was political, but also psychological. A person could be Roman in language, habit, legal status, or aspiration, even if far from the original city. The buildings of imperial Rome reflected this confidence. Forums multiplied. Baths became grand social landscapes of marble, steam, exercise, and conversation. Amphitheaters gathered crowds into shared spectacle. Temples, basilicas, aqueducts, and palaces all expressed the same deep Roman impulse toward ordered scale. Yet even here one should not imagine only spectacle. A bathhouse was also a place of routine. People came to wash, speak, rest, and listen. The great public spaces of Rome were not always dramatic, often they were woven into everyday rhythm. The magnificence of the empire was often felt through convenience and regularity. The aqueducts are especially serene to think about. Long arcs of stone, gentle inclines, hidden channels, and carefully maintained flows brought water into cities and towns. They are monuments to patience. They suggest a civilization thinking not just about victory, but about functioning. Water had to arrive every day. Fountains had to run. Baths had to fill. Households, workshops, and gardens depended on it. In a world without modern plumbing, this was a near-magical achievement of engineering and administration. It is not difficult to imagine a Roman standing near such a structure and feeling a quiet trust in the invisible work behind visible abundance. Rome's literature continued to mature under the empire. Historians such as Tacitus wrote with sharpness and gravity, aware of power's corrosive possibilities. Suetonius collected imperial lives with an eye for detail, anecdote, and personality. Later writers preserved memory of earlier ages with both admiration and unease. Their works remind us that the empire was not only an administrative machine, it was also a world of observers, critics, stylists, moralists, and storytellers. Civilizations are not maintained by force alone. They are also interpreted into being by those who write about them. At times, Roman history seems to move through a gallery of faces. Augustus, careful and elusive. Tiberius, reserved and shadowed. Caligula, infamous in later memory. Claudius, scholarly and unexpected. Nero, theatrical, controversial, and remembered through layers of rumor and loss. Each figure became larger than life in the retelling, which makes historical memory itself part of the story. Rome is not only what happened, it is what was said to have happened, what was feared, what was praised, and what was imagined afterward. Ancient biography often blurs into legend, and that blur is itself historically meaningful. This is especially true when we consider the 3rd century, one of the most unsettled periods of imperial history. Emperors rose and fell with bewildering speed. Borders were threatened, usurpations multiplied, the economy strained, plague and invasion unsettled confidence. Yet even in this period of crisis, the Roman world did not simply collapse into silence. It adapted. Power moved, forms changed, new structures emerged. The empire grew more overtly militarized and more administratively elaborate. In some ways, the 3rd century feels less like a single disaster than a series of corrections, improvisations, and survivals under stress. There is a melancholy dignity in that survival. A system need not be perfect to endure. It may be damaged, reworked, and still functional in altered form. Rome's late antiquity is often misunderstood as a mere prelude to fall, when in fact it was a period of transformation with its own vitality. Christianity spread through the empire, at first as a minority faith, then as a profoundly shaping force. Old pagan practices persisted in some places and faded in others. New theological questions, councils, and controversies emerged. The Roman world did not vanish at once. It changed its spiritual weather. Constantine's era marked another of those quiet turning points that can seem, in hindsight, more dramatic than they felt to those living through them. A vision, a battle, a new imperial favor for Christianity, the founding of Constantinople, the reconfiguration of sacred and political space. Yet again, continuity and rupture sit together. The emperor still rules, the court still functions, law still records, tax still moves, armies still guard. But the symbolic center shifts. The old gods lose official primacy. New churches rise where temples once stood or near them. The empire's inner language deepens and alters. Even then, Rome itself remained profoundly important as a place of memory, prestige, and tradition. Though the imperial center became more dispersed and the eastern cities gained prominence, Rome retained a special gravity. To be associated with Rome remained powerful. The city's old monuments, some already weathered, continue to speak. Travelers, officials, pilgrims, and later Christian visitors all moved through it as through an immense archive. A broken column can sometimes seem more eloquent than a perfect one because it invites the imagination to reconstruct what is missing. The fall of the Western Empire, when it came, is another event best thought of as a long dimming rather than a theatrical collapse. The city's authority in the West weakened over time under the pressure of internal division, economic strain, military dependence, and migration by various peoples, whom Roman writers often labeled in broad and anxious terms. The old structures did not simply vanish in a single night. Local powers grew stronger, provincial identities sharpened, imperial continuity became harder to maintain. Then the office of Western Emperor faded away, and one of history's most famous falls occurred almost quietly, at least compared to the stories later told about it. Yet even this was not an ending in the absolute sense. Roman law, language, administrative habits, and cultural memory lived on. The Eastern Empire, centered at Constantinople, preserved Roman identity in modified form for centuries. Medieval rulers elsewhere invoked Rome to strengthen their own claims. The papacy inherited and reshaped Roman space. Scholars copied ancient texts. Monks preserved fragments of Latin literature. Cities built over Roman foundations. Fields were ploughed around Roman tombs. The empire ended, and yet Rome remained operational in memory, ceremony, and structure. Archaeology has made that continuity feel more tangible. Excavations uncover houses, streets, toys, tools, amphorae, wall paintings, and graffiti. A wall scratched with a complaint, a blessing, a lover's note, or a crude joke can feel more intimate than a grand inscription. The ancient world emerges in pieces from the soil, and these pieces are often enough to suggest lives that were neither especially famous nor entirely lost. A loaf carbonized in an oven, a bronze lamp, a ring worn smooth, a medical instrument, a child's shoe, a worn staircase. Rome survives in part through such humble survivals. And perhaps there is a lesson in that for any reflective night. Great systems are remembered through their visible peaks, but they are lived through ordinary days. The Republic was sustained by procedures, the Empire by roads, taxes, grain, discipline, and habit. The legends of founding and the speeches of statesmen matter, but so do kitchens, courtyards, markets, workshops, barracks, and cemeteries. History's grand movements are made of these quieter spaces. If one listens closely enough, the Roman world becomes not a roar, but a low and steady murmur of human continuity. One may also pause over the Roman relationship to time itself. Romans loved ancestry, precedent, and examples from the past. Their calendars, festivals, anniversaries, and commemorations structured memory into public life. Triumphs recalled victories, funerals invoked lineage, monuments preserved names. Even acts of restoration carried the implication that something old and worthy had been recovered. This made Roman culture unusually conscious of time as a layered presence. The present was rarely just present, it arrived carrying ancestors behind it. This is one reason Roman ruins feel so expressive. A ruin is not merely damage, it is time made visible. A half-standing wall, an overturned capital, a mosaic worn by centuries of feet, a temple column reused in another building, all speak of succession and adaptation. Rome became one of the great ruined landscapes of the world, but its ruins are not empty. They are full of former functions and later memories. They invite a kind of respectful quiet. In that quiet, imagination can move gently among the broken forms and hear, if only faintly, the echo of markets, prayers, arguments, and footsteps. The empire also left behind a vast administrative memory. Names of provinces, ranks, titles, and offices can seem dry at first glance, yet they reveal the extraordinary ambition of Roman organization. To govern such a broad territory required enumeration and categorization. People were counted, taxed, assessed, and recorded. Land was measured, boundaries were marked, citizenship could be granted, widened, and redefined. The famous extension of citizenship to many free inhabitants of the empire reflected both ideal and practicality. It recognized a broader Roman world while helping bind that world together. Legal inclusion became a form of cohesion, and because Rome was so concerned with law, the later influence of Roman legal thought became one of its most enduring legacies. The details of contracts, inheritance, property, obligation, and personhood were refined over centuries. Even where later societies transformed Roman law to fit their own conditions, the Roman impulse toward clarity, classification, and precedent remained attractive. There is a calmness in law when it functions well, a desire to make social life more predictable. Rome never fully achieved perfect justice, as no state does, but it did leave behind a language for thinking about order. In literature, that same desire appears in different forms. The poets and historians of Rome often meditated on fate, fortune, and the instability of human greatness. Tragedy was never far away. The house of Atreus, the fall of Troy, the ambitions of commanders, the griefs of exiles, the loneliness of rulers, all found resonance in Roman retellings. Ancient Mediterranean cultures were linked by such stories, and Rome inherited them like a deep inheritance of dream. The city's own rise could be placed beside earlier myths of golden ages, ruined cities, wandering survivors, and kingdoms changed by divine will. To think about Rome, then, is to think about the persistence of civilization through alteration. It is to imagine how a republic can create the conditions for empire, how empire can preserve the language of republic, how collapse can still contain continuity, and how memory can outlast institutions. It is also to notice that every age calls itself modern, even when it is already becoming ancient. Romans themselves once looked back to earlier Romans as if they were remote. Later Europeans did the same. We do it too, though perhaps more quietly. The past always seems farther away until a story, a ruin, or a manuscript makes it suddenly near. There is a last gentle mystery in all this, why some civilizations become symbols far beyond their own boundaries. Rome is one of those rare names that means more than a place. It means law, power, architecture, language, decline, splendor, ambition, decay, and endurance. It means an old road under grass, a Latin phrase on a stone, a bust with weathered features, a column rising from a forum, a senate's echo, an emperor's proclamation, a poet's lament, a soldier's march, a mother's mourning, and a city that thought of itself as eternal even while changing every generation. Perhaps that is why the story still gathers listeners. It contains both the grandeur of the many and the vulnerability of the one. So the Republic can drift into empire, and empire into memory, and memory into scattered fragments that still hold together in the mind. The river Tiber continues its slow course. The 7 hills keep their shape. The Forum, though altered, still receives the light. The roads carry only modern feet, yet they remember older movement. And somewhere beneath all the noise of later centuries, there is the hush of an ancient city resting between rise and ruin, between lore and legend, between marble and dust. Let the story settle there now, in that patient twilight. Let its Senate debates, battlefield marches, triumphs, reforms, and quiet household scenes all soften into distance. Let the emperors become names, the names become inscriptions, the inscriptions become stone, and the stone become part of the night. Rome remains not as it was, but as a long, layered presence, ancient and enduring, vast and strangely intimate. And in that layered quiet, there is no need to hurry toward any conclusion. The Republic has done what it did. The Empire has passed through its centuries. The Western throne has fallen silent, but the memory continues to breathe softly in the dark, like a city seen from afar, lit by moonlight, already half in dream. And if we stay with that image a little longer, we can almost hear how Rome changed not only in government, but in the daily sound of life. In the Republican city, the forums had been places of argument, pleading, bargaining, and display. Voices rose there with the sharpness of public ambition. In the imperial city, those same spaces could feel more ceremonious, more ordered, and in some ways more distant from the old rough give and take of civic struggle. Power had not vanished, it had simply taken on a steadier face. The city became full of signs, rituals, and visible arrangements that suggested permanence. Even so, beneath the polished surface, there remained the same human softness, the same private anxieties, the same need to send letters, to buy bread, to prepare meals, to worry about children, to hope for good weather, to grieve absent friends. That is one of the quiet truths of antiquity. The grand names survive because the ordinary days made them possible. A republic is not only senators and laws. An empire is not only emperors and legions. They rest on labor, shipping, harvests, taxes, tools, roads, contracts, and the invisible patience of countless people who never appear in the books. Somewhere in Ostia, grain ships arrived with cargoes from Egypt and North Africa, carrying the food that fed a sprawling capital. Somewhere in a villa outside the city, olives were pressed and stored. Somewhere along a frontier river, a soldier mended his cloak. Somewhere in a marketplace, a child listened while an elder spoke of the old republic as if it were already a vanished age. These small scenes are not less important because they are quiet. They are the texture of history itself. The Roman world was also a world of roads, and roads have a special kind of memory. They gather footsteps from many centuries. A paved road can outlast the people who imagined it, the labourers who set its stones, the generals who ordered it, and the merchants who profited from it. In the Roman imagination, roads were practical, of course, but they were also symbols of connection and control. They linked city to city, coast to interior, province to province, and they made the empire feel like a single body with many limbs. Yet even a road can become a kind of ruin. When travel slows, when trade shifts, when power fractures, the route remains but the system around it thins. Then weeds grow in the cracks, and the road becomes less a command of civilization than a serene trace of it. If we think back to the earliest Romans, it is striking how much of their identity was tied to humble beginnings. The traditional stories of Romulus and Remus, of shepherds and hills, of early kings and rituals, belong to the realm of legend, but they reveal something persistent about Roman self-understanding. Rome liked to imagine itself as emerging from hardship and struggle, not from ease. It valued discipline, endurance, and the ability to build order where there had been uncertainty. Even the myths of origin carry this mood. There is the abandoned infant, the river, the wolf, the founding mark cut into the earth. There is also the uneasy violence of the first city, the fraternal conflict, the boundary crossed, the sacred line broken. Rome's beginning was never a simple dawn. It was already mixed with fate, loss, and tension. That mixture would remain with the city through all its centuries. The Romans inherited the stories of others, too, especially the Greeks and the peoples of the wider Mediterranean. They did not live in isolation. Their religion absorbed many gods and many customs, some from neighboring Italian communities, some from Etruscan practice, some from the Greek world, and later from farther provinces as the empire widened. This made Roman religion less like a sealed system and more like a living archive. Temples, altars, festivals, auguries, household shrines, and vows all belonged to a world in which divine favor was sought through careful observance. Public life and sacred life were entwined. To modern ears, some of these rites may seem distant, but they possessed a practical calm. They gave structure to uncertainty. They offered a way to speak to chance. There is something almost meditative in the Roman concern for signs. Birds, storms, omens, sacred chickens, auspices, prodigies in the sky or on the earth, these were not merely superstitions in the narrow sense. They were part of a cultural habit of reading the world as meaningful. The heavens did not float far away from politics or domestic life. A general might hesitate before battle if the signs were wrong. A magistrate might pause before assembly. A family might interpret a dream as a warning or blessing. In this way, the Roman world was full of listening. It listened to the gods, to the ancestors, to auspicious moments, and to the old authority of custom. Even in empire, this habit of listening remained, though often in more formal or private forms. The transformation from republic to empire was not a single door closing. It unfolded in stages, and those stages had their own moods. There were moments of crisis, some bright with opportunity and others dark with violence. The reforms and ambitions of the Gracchi, the rivalries of Marius and Sulla, the social strains of Italy, the pressures of citizenship, the growing wealth of conquest, the extraordinary powers granted in emergencies, these all changed the Republic before Augustus ever appeared. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the old balance was already fragile. By the time the civil wars ended, many Romans may have been weary enough to accept a new arrangement, even if they continued to cherish the memory of republican freedom. History often moves not only through enthusiasm, but through exhaustion. And Augustus, with his careful style and deliberate restraint, understood this very well. He did not simply declare a kingdom in the old manner. He wrapped authority in language of restoration. He spoke of healing, of returning peace, of bringing order after turmoil. The forms of the Republic were preserved long enough to make the change feel less abrupt, though everyone knew that the center had shifted. In the quiet language of statecraft, he gathered power while appearing to distribute it. A new age entered almost softly. That is one reason the Augustan settlement is so interesting. It was not only the conquest of opponents. It was also the creation of a mood, a civic atmosphere in which stability could be presented as a kind of mercy. The poets of that age understood the emotional weight of the change. Virgil in particular gave Rome a grand mythic frame. His Aeneid looked backward to Troy and forward to the city's imperial destiny, binding grief to purpose, exile to foundation, and suffering to future order. Aeneas is a famously burdened figure, carrying his household gods and the memory of a destroyed city. He is not triumphant in the simple sense. He is dutiful, pious, and often sorrowful. Through him, Rome could imagine itself as heir to ancient catastrophe and as the answer to long wandering. Yet even here the poem does not erase tragedy. It lingers on cost. The price of empire is never absent. It is simply transformed into narrative grandeur. There are places in Rome where that transformation still seems visible, even in ruin. The Palatine Hill, associated with imperial residences, holds layers of habitation and reconstruction. Beneath later palaces lie older traces, and beneath them perhaps still older ones. The ground itself is a palimpsest. One age builds over another without fully erasing it. Archaeology reveals how much of the city was made by repetition. Temples were rebuilt, walls repaired, houses altered, courtyards repaved, statues re-erected, inscriptions reused. The ancient city was not static. It was constantly becoming itself again. There is comfort in this, perhaps. Even what seems most monumental was once maintained by ordinary hands. The same sense of layered continuity can be felt in Roman law, which became one of the civilization's most enduring gifts. The famous compilations of later centuries did not arise from a single moment. They grew from practices of interpretation, adaptation, and administrative need. Romans had a talent for making rules articulate. They liked categories, distinctions, and definitions. There is a quiet beauty in that intellectual habit. It does not have the drama of conquest, yet it shaped the lives of millions. Inheritance, contracts, marriage, property, citizenship, obligations, public office, and private dispute all could be framed within legal language. This is part of why Rome remains alive in modern memory. Its empire has fallen, but many of its methods of thinking continue to echo in systems far beyond the old Mediterranean world. Citizenship itself is one of the most fascinating Roman ideas. At first it was narrow, tied to a particular community and its privileges. Over time it widened, especially as Rome incorporated allies, Italian communities, provincial elites, and finally many more inhabitants of the empire. This expansion was not simply generous, it was also strategic, binding diverse populations to the Roman order. Still, there is something remarkable in the gradual growth of belonging. The meaning of being Roman became less about local origin and more about participation in a larger civil structure. That change helped make empire durable for a time because it allowed distant peoples to imagine a place within the whole. Even so, belonging in the Roman world remained uneven, graded, and often dependent on wealth, status, and favor. Expansion did not erase hierarchy, it rearranged it. One can imagine the imperial provinces as vast, varied landscapes, each with its own tone. Gaul with its rivers and settlements, Spain with its mines and roads, North Africa with its grain and desert edges, Greece with its old sanctuaries and philosophical memory, Syria with its cities and caravan routes, Egypt with its ancient river and its own deep civilization older than Rome itself. The empire did not flatten all these places into sameness. It brought them into a common political horizon while leaving many local identities intact. Temples to local gods stood beside Roman altars. Local languages continued in speech and inscription. Merchants moved between cultures. Soldiers were posted far from home. Administrators learned the practical art of governing difference. The empire's apparent unity depended on a great deal of diversity held in delicate balance. That balance was sometimes visible in the household sphere, where Roman families kept their own gods and memories. The Narration, the domestic shrine, could hold small images of protective spirits. A family meal might begin with a quiet acknowledgement of these household powers. The home was not only private in the modern sense, it was also a miniature sacred world. Marriage, birth, naming, inheritance, funerary rites, all were embedded in custom. Even the textures of Roman domestic life tell us something about the civilization's stability and fragility. A lamp in the evening, a folded cloak, a bronze key, a ring, a comb, a small figurine, a ceramic bowl, a sponge, a lock, a wax tablet for notes. These humble things carried the rhythm of days. They are the remnants most likely to survive excavation, and somehow they feel more intimate than triumphal arches. In the city, meanwhile, public spectacle created another layer of social life. Triumphs, games, ceremonies, processions, and funerals all made the population aware of rank and performance. A Roman triumph was a carefully arranged vision of order after war, a controlled display of foreign riches, captives, standards, and divine favor. It was meant to honor a general, yes, but also the state itself. Yet even triumphs had an undertone of transience. The laurel, the chariot, the crowds, the songs of acclaim, they all passed. The glitter of victory could not prevent later disappointment. Indeed, the emperors who followed would often use spectacle as one more way of shaping memory. A building, a coin, a statue, a festival, these could keep an image alive long after the moment had gone. Coins are especially eloquent relics of Rome. Small and portable, they carried faces, symbols, and claims of legitimacy into every corner of the empire. A coin could travel farther than most people. It moved through markets, military pay, taxes, and daily exchange. It passed from hand to hand, losing its sharpness with use. On its surface might appear the profile of an emperor, a temple, a victory goddess, a personification of peace, abundance, or fidelity. Coins remind us that political authority was not abstract. It circulated, it touched the everyday. And because coins endure, they allow historians to read the changing messages of power almost year by year. They are tiny documents of atmosphere. Some proclaim confidence, others hint at crisis. Together they form a silent, metallic chronology. As the empire matured, it also changed the shape of memory. The old republican families still mattered, but their prominence was increasingly filtered through the imperial court and the emperor's favor. Aristocratic ambition now had to navigate a more concentrated center. That could produce elegance, but also anxiety. A senator might possess wealth, ancestry, and education, yet still feel dependent on the shifting mood of power. In such a world, public speech became more cautious. Historians and poets sometimes wrote with a double awareness. They recorded events and they also measured the risks of recording them. Tacitus, for example, is often read as a master of compressed judgment, his prose filled with the tension between what can be said and what must be inferred. History under empire became, in part, an art of reading between the lines. There is a stillness in the long reign of Augustus and the generations that followed, but it is a stillness with movement beneath it. Administrative reforms, tax systems, provincial governance, road maintenance, army organization, frontier defense, and succession planning all required attention. The empire was never a machine that ran by itself. It had to be tended. Emperors came and went, some capable, some cruel, some scholarly, some precarious. The Flavian dynasty, the Antonines, the Severans, and the many shorter reigns in between each left their own atmosphere. Some eras felt orderly, almost serene from a distance. Others were marked by rapid turnover and uncertainty, yet even upheaval could be absorbed for a time within the immense scale of Roman institutions. Perhaps that is one reason the empire lasted as long as it did. Scale can hide strain. A system that spans seas and deserts can endure local shocks because its parts are so numerous and its resources so varied. But scale can also make a system vulnerable in ways that are slow to notice. A frontier that seems secure one decade may be stretched thin the next. A treasury that seems adequate may be depleted by war, corruption, or inflation. A political order that depends heavily on the person of the ruler may suffer when succession becomes uncertain. The Roman world knew all these pressures. It responded with bureaucracy, military reorganization, ideological claims, and practical improvisation. For centuries, that was enough. Beyond the city and the court, the empire's interior life included many religions and philosophies. Stoicism found particular resonance among Roman elites, perhaps because it offered a way to think about duty, fate, and self-command in a world of political instability. There is a serene austerity in Stoic writing that suits the Roman temperament in some eras. It asks one to distinguish between what can be controlled and what cannot, to bear misfortune without surrendering reason, and to accept the larger order of nature. Epicurean thought, too, had its quiet place, especially in the calmer pursuit of simplicity and freedom from fear. Christianity would later transform the religious landscape of the empire, but before that, the Roman world already contained a remarkable plurality of beliefs. Temples, cults, philosophical schools, household practices, and mystery religions all existed alongside one another like different languages for the soul. The city of Rome itself was not merely a political center, but a living accumulation of earlier cities within itself. The walls, the aqueducts, the baths, the theatres, the basilicas, the temples, the palaces, and the crowded insulae formed a complex organism. Water came from faraway sources along carefully engineered channels, descending into fountains and baths with a composure that still inspires wonder. The aqueducts are among the most graceful of Roman achievements because they embody utility without visible strain. They carry water in long, measured lines across valleys and hills, turning landscape into infrastructure. Even in ruin, an aqueduct arch is a beautiful thing. It suggests both confidence in engineering and the patience needed to shape the natural world without haste. Baths, too, reveal another side of Roman life: sociability, routine, and the blending of body and public space. Large public baths were places of washing, rest, conversation, exercise, and leisure. They brought together people from different social backgrounds, though always within hierarchy. There were cold rooms, warm rooms, hot rooms, pools, oils, and attendants. The bath was practical, but it was also a ritual of urban rhythm. After a day of business or labor, one could enter a more ordered atmosphere where the body was cared for and the mind might loosen. It is not difficult to imagine the low murmur of such a place, the sound of water, the echo of footsteps, the smell of oil and stone, the sense that the day had temporarily set aside its demands. Yet even in this world of order, the ancient city remained vulnerable to fire, disease, and crowding. The dense housing of Rome, especially among the less affluent, made urban life precarious. Wooden structures, narrow streets, and household cooking could turn a spark into disaster. Plagues moved through the empire as well, reminding everyone that administrative power could not fully master the biology of life. Human beings in the ancient world knew, as we do, that civilization rests on delicate foundations. Brick and marble feel durable until they are not. Institutions seem solid until they are interrupted by war, migration, epidemic, or internal fracture. Rome's greatness was real, but so was its fragility. In the later empire, this fragility became more visible. Power shifted more often, armies played larger roles in imperial succession, and the old unity of the Mediterranean world grew harder to sustain. Yet even this later period should not be imagined only as decline. It was also adaptation. New capitals emerged, old ones lost prominence, the administrative structure changed, military needs evolved, and the empire learned to survive by becoming different from itself. Constantinople would rise as a new center in the eastern Mediterranean, carrying Roman authority into another form. The very idea of Rome outlived the city's political supremacy. It became portable, transferable, and symbolic. That too is a kind of endurance. By the time the Western imperial court vanished, much had already changed in the texture of life. Cities had contracted in some regions, trade patterns had shifted, and local powers had grown more important. The old civic world of the early empire could no longer be assumed, yet the end was not a clean break. Texts continue to be copied. Latin remained a language of administration and learning. Bishops, kings, monks, and scholars inherited fragments of Roman order and reinterpreted them in new ways. Stone from old monuments was reused in churches and walls. Law codes were preserved. Memory traveled through manuscripts and ritual. Rome fell, if we use that word, but it also dispersed into later Europe and beyond, leaving traces in architecture, vocabulary, law, calendar, and imagination. It can be calming to think of history in that way, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a long continuation in altered shape. Civilizations rarely end all at once. They are translated. One order becomes another, and the old survives in pieces, sometimes in institutions, sometimes in stories, sometimes in the very names of months and offices. Augustus and Caesar became titles, then memories, then references in other languages. The Republic became an ideal as much as a government. Empire became a lesson, a warning, an aspiration, and a symbol. Later ages would turn to Rome whenever they wanted to speak of grandeur or decay, of discipline or overreach, of civic virtue or imperial ambition. Even now, the ruins of Rome invite a peculiar kind of attention. They do not shout, they simply remain. A broken column, a half-buried inscription, a faded mosaic, a fragment of statuary, a stretch of road, a vaulted chamber with light falling through a gap in the roof. These are not only remnants, they are invitations to patience. To look at a ruin is to accept that time has layers, and that every layer has its own silence. The ancient stones do not tell us everything, they keep their mysteries. We do not know every face that passed through the forum, every fear that entered a household, every conversation in a workshop, every prayer whispered in a temple, every compromise made in a Senate house, every grief born in a villa garden. The past remains partly hidden, and perhaps that is fitting. Mystery is part of its gentleness. There is also something moving about the Roman habit of commemoration. Tombs, epitaphs, funerary reliefs, ancestral masks, inscriptions, and public monuments all indicate a civilization deeply aware of continuity with the dead. Families remembered their members, cities remembered benefactors, emperors remembered victories, citizens remembered offices and honors. Even the simplest funerary stone could preserve a name, an age, a relationship, a phrase of affection. This is one of the most tender survivals from antiquity. So many lives are lost to silence, but some remain because a hand once carved a line into marble or stone, hoping that memory would outlast breath. In this way, Roman death culture was not only solemn, it was a plea against oblivion, and perhaps that is one reason Rome still feels so near. Its remains are not complete, but they are abundant. We can walk among them, we can read them, we can imagine the people who made and used them. A child in a Roman courtyard, a magistrate climbing the steps to office, a merchant counting coins, a mother adjusting a veil, a scribe dipping a pen, a veteran recalling a distant campaign, a slave opening a door at dawn, a priest tending a flame, a poet composing in a shaded room, a farmer arriving from the countryside, a messenger on the Appian Way, a statue maker smoothing the surface of stone. These figures form a world that is lost and yet legible in fragments. When we follow Rome from republic to empire, we are also following a broader pattern in human life. The way ideals can harden into structures, the way structures can outgrow their original purpose, the way security can become dependence, and the way memory can preserve what politics has changed. The Republic prized shared authority and public competition. The Empire prized order, reach, and continuity. Each answered certain needs, and each created new tensions. Neither was simple. Neither was pure. The ancient world reminds us that governance is always a matter of balance, pressure, compromise, and unintended consequences. There is no perfectly stable city, no eternal constitution, no final form that escapes history. Still, the Roman imagination often reached for eternity. The city on the 7 hills was called eternal not because it would literally never change, but because it had mastered for a long while the art of making change seem like destiny. That is a profound political achievement, though not a permanent one. Time eventually loosens every claim. Dynasties fade. Palaces crumble. Edicts become footnotes, yet a civilization can survive as a kind of echo. Rome's echo is especially long. It reaches into law, language, literature, architecture, and the very idea of the West as later thinkers imagined it. It also reaches into cautionary tales, into reflections on power, into the quiet recognition that all human greatness is temporary. So let the Republic continue to soften into memory. Let the imperial marble take on the pale shade of moonlight. Let the legions rest in their distant camps, their standards lowered. Let the senators walk out of the curia and dissolve into the dark lanes of the city. Let the emperors pass through their ceremonies and vanish into the line of names. Let the provinces keep their rivers, their temples, their farms, their markets, and their local stories. Let the roads grow quiet. Let the aqueducts keep their arches against the sky. Let the forum empty into evening. And let Rome, in all its layered history, remain for a while as a calm and ancient presence, not demanding anything, only enduring. In that endurance there is a certain peace, not the peace of certainty, but the peace that comes from seeing how much can survive as residue, as memory, as shape. The Republic became empire, the empire became late empire, the late empire became fragments, the fragments became heritage, scholarship, ruin, and dream. And the dream of Rome continues, gentle and immense, moving through centuries like a river beneath stone. So now the story can grow still. The voices fade, the roads dim, the marble cools, the inscriptions sink back into shadow. The old city lies beneath the night, and above it the sky remains vast and unhurried. Ancient Rome, with all its ambition and all its sorrow, all its lore and all its legend, settles at last into the quiet from which history is always remembered.